The airport terminal buzzed with chaos, passengers rushing in every direction while announcements crackled overhead. In one shattering instant, everything froze. A loud crack split the air like a whip, echoing through the crowded boarding gate. An elderly woman's cane flew from her trembling hand and clattered across the polished tile floor. A gasp swept through the crowd as she instinctively raised a shaking hand to shield herself, her pale blue eyes wide with disbelief. Standing rigidly before her was the flight attendant, her name tag gleaming coldly under the harsh lights. Bridget Harlan. Bridget's face twisted with open disdain, her eyes blazing with impatience as she jabbed a finger toward the boarding gate. "I told you clearly to move aside," she snapped, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "First-class boarding isn't for people like you." A heavy, shocked silence fell over the terminal. No one dared move. Whispers of discomfort stirred, but still, no one intervened. The elderly woman, Eleanor Hargrove, did not cry out or protest. Her hand trembled slightly. Yet, with incredible dignity and quiet defiance, she bent slowly, painstakingly, and picked up her cane. Straightening with a grace that stood in stark contrast to Bridget's aggression, Eleanor looked directly into the attendant's eyes. Her gaze held no anger, only something far deeper, far more powerful, a quiet, piercing calm that unsettled even the hardened flight attendant. In a steady, quiet voice that carried unmistakable power, Eleanor spoke words that sent chills down the spines of everyone within earshot. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your entire career." Before we continue the story, leave a comment below letting us know where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. A short while earlier, the airport lounge had hummed with the gentle clinking of coffee cups and soft murmurs of conversation. In a secluded corner by the expansive window sat Eleanor Hargrove, her hands delicately folded atop the carved ivory handle of her elegant cane. Dressed in a refined but understated emerald green dress, a delicate brooch pinned carefully above her heart, her silver hair styled into soft waves, she carried an air of quiet sophistication. To most travelers rushing past, she appeared to be just another elderly woman patiently awaiting her flight. Nearby, a sharply dressed younger man, Desmond Fletcher, glanced up from his laptop and noticed her dignified presence. He instinctively stood, politely gesturing toward his seat with a respectful nod. "Would you like my seat, ma'am?" he offered kindly. Eleanor raised her eyes to meet his, offering a gentle, appreciative smile. "Thank you, young man, but I am quite comfortable." Desmond nodded respectfully and returned to his seat, unaware of the true identity and significance of the graceful woman seated just steps away. At the bustling check-in counter, flight attendants moved briskly, their clipped voices directing passengers. Among them, Bridget Harlan stood out, tall, severe, and self-assured. Her dark hair pulled tightly back accentuated sharp features that rarely softened. She had long served the first-class cabin and wore her authority like an invisible crown, making snap judgments about who was worthy of her exclusive domain. Her eyes scanned the lounge, swiftly categorizing passengers. She acknowledged those who fit her ideal image, expensive suits, designer luggage, authoritative demeanors, while dismissing anyone who fell short. When her gaze briefly landed on Eleanor, Bridget paused, her lip curling slightly in disdain before she quickly moved on, barely registering the elderly woman's presence. Her attention returned sharply to the high-profile business executives she intended to serve attentively on this flight, completely unaware that Eleanor Hargrove was no ordinary traveler, and certainly someone whose dignity should never be questioned. As the announcement for first-class boarding echoed through the terminal, Eleanor calmly rose from her seat. She carefully adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and tightened her delicate grip on the polished ivory handle of her cane. She moved toward the boarding gate unhurriedly, each step deliberate and composed, as though time itself held no sway over her. Other passengers hurried around her, eager to settle into their seats, barely noticing her quiet dignity. When Eleanor reached the gate, she gracefully extended her boarding pass. Bridget barely glanced at the ticket before abruptly lifting her hand, blocking Eleanor with visible irritation. "Ma'am, this line is exclusively for first-class passengers," Bridget stated crisply, her tone superficially polite yet dripping with contempt. Eleanor slowly raised her gaze, meeting Bridget's dismissive eyes directly. Her expression remained calm yet unreadable. I'm fully aware, she replied gently, her voice steady and composed. Bridget exhaled sharply, irritation deepening on her face as she studied the boarding pass more carefully, her brow furrowed in disbelief, clearly skeptical that an elderly woman with such modest appearance could possibly hold a legitimate first-class ticket. Are you absolutely sure this is your ticket? Bridget asked condescendingly, tilting her head mockingly, clearly anticipating Eleanor, to admit some error or misunderstanding. Eleanor, however, remained impeccably calm, showing no offense at the degrading question. Yes, I am quite certain, she answered quietly, unwavering. Bridget pursed her lips impatiently, glancing behind Eleanor, as if expecting a caregiver or companion to step in and clarify the supposed misunderstanding. Yet no one came forward. Eleanor was traveling alone. Sighing exaggeratedly, Bridget shook her head dismissively, her voice now raised slightly, intentionally audible to those around. Clearly, there's been some kind of mistake, she said patronizingly, as if explaining a basic concept to a confused child. First class is reserved for specific passengers, she continued, waving her hand dismissively toward the economy boarding gate. You belong over there. Eleanor stood motionless, her serene gaze never wavering, undisturbed by Bridget's increasingly disrespectful tone. After a deliberate pause, Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice firm and authoritative. There is no mistake. This is my seat. Bridget's jaw visibly tightened, anger flickering across her face. She had encountered countless passengers before, those attempting to sneak into first class with fake tickets or illegitimate upgrades, and had absolutely no tolerance left. Frustrated, she held Eleanor's ticket up against the overhead lights, scrutinizing it dramatically for signs of forgery. I don't know how you managed to obtain this, Bridget muttered under her breath, her voice laced with suspicion and disgust, but you won't be sitting here today. Behind Eleanor, the boarding line grew tense as curious onlookers began exchanging uncomfortable glances. Callum Everett, the young businessman who had earlier offered Eleanor his seat, tensed visibly, hesitating as though he wanted to intervene but choosing silence. Bridget's patience snapped completely. Her voice became harsh and cutting, openly humiliating Eleanor. I've had enough of this nonsense. Step aside immediately. When Eleanor remained resolute, not giving an inch, Bridget's composure broke entirely. With a sudden, shocking motion, she violently slapped the boarding pass out of Eleanor's hand. The sharp sound pierced through the terminal like a whip crack, causing passengers to gasp audibly. Eleanor's cane fell from her grip, hitting the polished floor with an echoing clatter. A stunned silence descended over the gate area. Naomi Ellison, a woman standing nearby, covered her mouth in horror. Callum's jaw tightened with anger, his eyes wide with disbelief. Yet Bridget seemed utterly indifferent to their reactions. I told you to move, she snapped coldly, voice raised without an ounce of remorse. But Eleanor, instead of recoiling or protesting, slowly bent down to retrieve her fallen cane. Her movements were graceful yet powerful in their calm dignity. Rising once more to her full height, she met Bridget's glare directly. Her clear eyes radiated a quiet, formidable strength that made the attendant instinctively step backward. The tension hung heavy between them, almost suffocating. Then Eleanor spoke softly yet clearly, her calm, quiet voice sending an unmistakable chill through the air. You've just made the gravest mistake of your entire career. Bridget scoffed, an uneasy laugh forced from her throat, though her eyes shifted nervously beneath Eleanor's unwavering stare. Ma'am, I don't have time for these theatrics, she said coldly, her voice dripping with contempt. If you refuse to move, I'll have security escort you out immediately. The crowd around them began murmuring louder, discomfort and disbelief rippling through the gathering passengers. Callum Everett clenched his jaw tightly, visibly wrestling with whether or not he should intervene. Naomi Ellison anxiously scanned the surrounding faces, desperately hoping someone would speak up. Yet nobody did. They simply stared in silent anticipation, captivated by the drama unfolding before them. Unfazed, Eleanor stood her ground, her composure extraordinary despite the humiliation she had just endured. She calmly retrieved her fallen cane, grasping it firmly with a dignity that only deepened Bridget's irritation. Her voice remained steady, poised, and firm, cutting through the tension. I have a first-class ticket and I intend to board this flight in my rightful seat. Bridget drew a sharp, irritated breath through clenched teeth, shaking her head incredulously. Unbelievable, she muttered bitterly under her breath. Without another glance at Eleanor, Bridget spun sharply towards Sophia Langford, a younger flight attendant standing nearby. "Sophia, call security! Now!" Sophia hesitated visibly, her eyes darting uncertainly between Bridget and Eleanor. Something about this entire exchange felt deeply wrong. Eleanor Hargrove wasn't behaving like someone who had made an error or been caught doing something dishonest. She displayed none of the expected signs of panic or nervousness. Instead, she radiated a calm authority that made Sophia pause. Bridget's impatient glare intensified, however, forcing Sophia to reluctantly reach for the intercom. But before Sophia could summon security, a commanding voice interrupted sharply. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned simultaneously to see a senior airline official striding confidently toward them. Victor Langston moved swiftly, his perfectly tailored suit reflecting an aura of indisputable authority. His badge clipped prominently to his chest. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold yet fiercely authoritative. Ignoring Bridget entirely, he approached Eleanor directly, respectfully inclining his head. "Mrs. Hargrove," he spoke with clear reverence. "My sincerest apologies for the unacceptable delay. Your seat is ready, and we're honored to have you aboard." Bridget blinked in stunned disbelief, her mouth opening briefly before snapping shut again. Her voice trembled, barely audible. "Wait, what?" Only now did Victor turn toward Bridget, his gaze steely and unforgiving. "Step aside immediately, Miss Harlan," he ordered quietly, his tone brooking no argument. A heavy, oppressive silence engulfed the terminal. Bridget felt the ground beneath her sway as panic began tightening its grip around her throat. Her fingers clenched around Eleanor's boarding pass, the crumpled ticket trembling slightly. "There must be a misunderstanding," she stammered weakly, desperately forcing a strained chuckle. She. Victor interrupted her sharply, his tone ice cold. "There is no misunderstanding. Did you even bother checking the system before publicly humiliating this passenger?" Bridget's throat constricted suddenly, unable to respond. She had scanned the boarding pass briefly, but never bothered verifying the passenger information in the system. Her stomach churned with sickening realization. She had made a grievous assumption. Victor's eyes narrowed further, reading her silence clearly. Without waiting for Bridget's reply, he turned sharply toward Sophia. "Sophia, kindly escort Mrs. Hargrove to her rightful seat immediately." His voice left absolutely no room for debate. Sophia quickly stepped forward, her voice gentle and respectful. "Right this way, Mrs. Hargrove," she offered softly. As Eleanor passed, she cast a final penetrating glance toward Bridget. It was a look devoid of anger, yet filled with profound disappointment, a silent indictment heavier than any words could convey. Passengers instinctively stepped aside, parting to allow Eleanor through, the rhythmic tap of her cane echoing with undeniable authority. Bridget felt her heart pounding painfully in her chest, humiliation burning fiercely beneath the intense gazes fixed upon her. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear him clearly. "When this plane takes off, you and I will have a very serious conversation," he warned quietly, his tone dangerously calm. Bridget swallowed hard. The murmurs of disapproval from the watching passengers burned her ears. The solid ground beneath her suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. She stood frozen, helpless, as Victor walked away, his quiet threat lingering in the air like an invisible judgment. Around them, the passengers returned slowly to their own conversations, but furtive, judgmental glances lingered upon Bridget, each look questioning the depths of her terrible misjudgment. Meanwhile, Sophia carefully led Eleanor through the jet bridge, her movements gentle and deferential, sensing clearly now that this was no ordinary passenger. This elderly woman carried herself with an unmistakable authority, an aura of understated but undeniable importance that had been grossly underestimated. Unlike Bridget Harlan, Sophia Langford carefully guided Eleanor Hargrove into the first-class cabin, her gestures gentle and respectful. "I'm truly sorry for what happened back there, ma'am," Sophia said softly, her voice sincere with regret. "I should have stepped in earlier." Eleanor turned toward Sophia, offering a gentle, reassuring smile as she settled comfortably into her seat, carefully placing her cane by her side. "It's quite all right, my dear," Eleanor replied graciously, adjusting her silk scarf slightly. "Unfortunately, I've encountered many people like her in my lifetime." Sophia hesitated, curiosity overcoming her professional restraint. Lowering her voice respectfully, she asked softly, "May I ask who exactly you are?" Eleanor's eyes sparkled briefly, a hint of mystery dancing in her gaze, but she chose not to answer directly. Instead, she merely leaned back into the plush first-class seat with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes, silently asserting her rightful place. Sophia understood the subtle cue, nodding gently and stepping away, her mind buzzing with intrigue and admiration. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Bridget Harlan forced herself toward the galley, each step mechanical, her shoulders tense with humiliation. Her hands trembled as she reached for a cup of water, her mind desperately racing to process what had just unfolded. Why had Victor Langston reacted so sharply, and why had the elderly woman Eleanor Hargrove walked away, as if she had triumphed, effortlessly? Before Bridget could take a single sip, the plane's intercom crackled ominously. "Miss Harlan, report to the cockpit immediately." The paper cup crumpled slightly in her clenched hand, panic surging through her veins. Bridget had never been summoned to the cockpit before a flight in her entire career. A cold dread settled heavily within her as she slowly turned toward the cockpit, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. Her mind desperately attempted to rationalize the summons. Perhaps it was merely procedural. Perhaps Victor just wanted a private word before takeoff. But deep down, she already knew better. As Bridget stepped cautiously inside, the atmosphere hit her instantly, a palpable, oppressive tension. Captain Marcus Hawthorne sat upright in his seat, hands steady on the controls, but his eyes were cold, sharp, and accusing. On the cockpit's monitor, connected via video call, was a familiar face, Derek Langley, one of the airline's highest-ranking corporate executives. His gaze alone was enough to drain all color from Bridget's face, sending a fresh wave of panic crashing through her. Victor Langston stood silently to the side, arms folded tightly across his chest, clearly displeased. The heavy silence in the cockpit felt like an unbreakable chain tightening around Bridget's throat. Derek's voice broke through first, firm and chillingly calm. "Miss Harlan, explain immediately why you publicly humiliated a passenger traveling in first class." Bridget's mouth went dry instantly. I I didn't humiliate her," she stammered weakly, desperately trying to find footing. "I simply thought there was some kind of error with her boarding pass." Derek narrowed his eyes, his tone sharpening. "Did you actually verify that supposed error before denying her entry and assaulting her dignity?" Bridget froze, unable to form a coherent answer. Captain Hawthorne exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples in obvious frustration. Victor Langston's patience had worn thin, his voice sliced through the tension. "Answer the question immediately." Bridget's voice shook with shame. "No," she admitted painfully. I I made an assumption." Derek Langley exhaled slowly, his voice dropping dangerously lower. "Miss Harlan, do you have any idea who you just insulted and publicly shamed?" Bridget's fingers trembled nervously against her uniform. She struggled desperately to connect the dots, unable to comprehend how the elderly woman she had so blatantly dismissed could be anyone other than an ordinary passenger. "She was just an elderly passenger," she murmured, voice barely audible. Derek's expression darkened further, his voice icy and deliberate. "That woman was Eleanor Hargrove, the chairwoman and founder of this airline." The revelation hit Bridget like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Captain Hawthorne glanced sideways, his expression stony and unreadable. Victor Langston didn't even attempt to conceal his disappointment and disdain. Derek Langley continued relentlessly, his voice carrying the weight of her devastating error. "You publicly humiliated the most powerful woman in this industry, a woman who single-handedly built this airline from nothing, in front of passengers, crew members, and staff who will never forget your behavior." Bridget felt her knees weakening beneath her chest constricted painfully. Her mind reeled with disbelief. She had publicly struck, shamed, and humiliated the airline's very founder, the one person who commanded absolute respect from every level of this organization. Derek let the silence linger painfully before delivering his final blow. "You have one chance, exactly one, to fix the damage you've caused. You will return immediately to Mrs. Hargrove, publicly apologize to her in front of every passenger who witnessed your disgraceful behavior, and personally ensure she receives impeccable, exemplary treatment throughout this entire flight. Refuse or fail in any way, and your career will end the very moment this plane touches down." Bridget's throat tightened violently. Her pulse thundered loudly in her ears as Derek's words echoed relentlessly within her mind. Eleanor Hargrove, founder, chairwoman, the most influential woman in aviation. How could she have been so blindly arrogant, so deeply ignorant? She forced herself to speak, though her voice felt distant, foreign. I I didn't realize. You didn't realize what? Victor's voice cut through harshly, impatience flaring unmistakably. That she didn't fit your preconceived idea of a first-class passenger? Bridget flinched visibly, the bitter truth stinging her deeply. Derek interrupted sharply, coldly unyielding. Miss Harlan, if you had recognized her name, if you had any inkling of her true identity, would you have dared treat her as you did? Bridget opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. They all knew the brutal truth. If she had known Eleanor Hargrove's true identity, she would have shown nothing but absolute respect. Her silence betrayed the harsh reality hanging heavily over the cockpit, undeniable. Captain Hawthorne shook his head slightly, visibly troubled. Victor exhaled sharply, disappointment etched deeply into his face. Derek merely nodded once, as though expecting exactly this result. Go, he instructed coldly. You will issue a full, unequivocal public apology immediately. You will personally escort Mrs. Hargrove to her seat. Understand clearly, this is not a request. It is your only opportunity to retain your position. Fail, and you will never wear this airline's uniform again. Bridget nodded stiffly, shame burning fiercely beneath her skin. Understood, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Captain Hawthorne offered no support. Victor Langston offered no sympathy. Bridget turned. Each step back toward the cabin felt excruciating. The moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt every passenger's eyes upon her, judgment radiating openly from their stares. They might not have known every detail, but they certainly knew enough. The murmurs and whispers from the boarding gate had followed her onto the plane, and now Bridget could feel their heavy weight pressing down upon her like an inescapable spotlight. Now every step Bridget Harlan took toward Eleanor Hargrove felt like an agonizing march of shame. Eleanor sat gracefully in her seat, entirely at ease, her cane placed neatly beside her. Sophia Langford lingered close by, watching carefully, uncertain how the situation would unfold, sensing that this was far from over. Bridget stopped stiffly beside Eleanor, her hands trembling visibly as she forced herself to utter the words she'd never imagined she'd have to say. Mrs. Hargrove. Her voice cracked noticeably, betraying her profound discomfort. She swallowed desperately, trying again. I must sincerely apologize for the way I treated you earlier. Eleanor turned her head slowly, meeting Bridget's anxious eyes with a serene expression that held an unsettling intensity. Something mysterious, almost piercing, lay behind the elderly woman's calm gaze. The silence stretched painfully between them. Passengers nearby subtly leaned in, curiosity piquing their whispers, intensifying. Even Sophia held her breath, uncertain yet captivated. Bridget felt a fresh wave of humiliation burn through her. She'd openly belittled Eleanor, treated her like an annoyance, dismissed her worthiness without a second thought. And now, Bridget herself stood diminished and humiliated. She inhaled shakily, forcing herself onward, her voice trembling with deepening shame. I misjudged you. My actions were wrong. I showed you disrespect in front of everyone here. Eleanor didn't respond immediately, deliberately allowing the words to linger heavily in the charged air, ensuring Bridget felt their full weight. Finally, she nodded once, her expression composed. I accept your apology, she replied quietly. Bridget exhaled slightly, relief flickering briefly across her face, believing that at last the ordeal was over. But just as she began to turn away, Eleanor calmly lifted her glass of water, took a delicate sip, and added something that instantly caused Bridget's stomach to drop. Now please repeat that apology for them. The air inside the cabin shifted instantly, growing colder, thicker. Bridget blinked, her heart sinking deeper into dread. Repeat it for who? Eleanor gestured gracefully toward the rows of passengers. For all those who witnessed your behavior, who heard you demean and humiliate an elderly passenger, who saw you slap the hand of the very woman who built this airline from the ground up. Eleanor said calmly, her voice steady and clear, I've accepted your apology personally, but they deserve to hear it too. Bridget felt the blood drain rapidly from her face. A chill ran through her, an overwhelming wave of dread and humiliation washing over her as every passenger's eyes now openly stared, awaiting her words. The aircraft's gentle hum underscored a deafening silence thick with tension and judgment. Her body went rigid. Apologizing privately had been mortifying enough, but publicly admitting her error, openly acknowledging her prejudice and arrogance, felt utterly crushing. Bridget felt indignation rise within her briefly, anger that no passenger had stepped forward earlier, yet now eagerly awaited her public downfall. Why should she bear this shame alone? Yet Derek Langley's warning was unmistakably clear. Without genuine remorse, her career would end before the plane even reached its destination. Bridget clenched her fists tightly at her sides, then slowly forced her arms to relax. She swallowed painfully, feeling the judgmental gaze of Victor Langston from the front of the cabin, his arms crossed, offering no mercy, only stern expectation. She had created this humiliation herself, and now she had no choice but to face it head on. Drawing a ragged breath, Bridget raised her voice just loud enough to carry, though each word felt like tearing a wound further open. I owe an apology to every passenger here. An immediate ripple of murmurs ran through the cabin. Several passengers shifted, focusing intently now. Callum Everett, the businessman who earlier had nearly intervened, raised an eyebrow sharply, his gaze unwavering. Naomi Ellison, the woman who had gasped audibly at the earlier humiliation, watched Bridget with quiet yet pointed satisfaction. Forcing herself onward, Bridget continued, her voice trembling yet firm enough to be clearly heard, each word a struggle against her battered pride. Before boarding, I made an unjustified assumption about a passenger. My actions toward Mrs. Hargrove were disrespectful and completely inappropriate. I questioned her right to sit in first class without any valid reason, and I humiliated her publicly. The murmurs intensified, shock mingling with acknowledgement among the passengers. They had witnessed Bridget's earlier contempt, heard her biting, condescending tone, but hearing the apology out loud carried an entirely different, heavier weight. Bridget's pulse thundered in her ears, yet she forced herself to lift her chin, facing her accountability openly, even as her cheeks burned with shame. My behavior was unprofessional, unfair, and utterly unacceptable. For this, I sincerely apologize. A deafening silence followed, painfully oppressive. Bridget wasn't certain what she had expected, perhaps some acknowledgement or murmurs of forgiveness. But instead, the passengers only stared, their silent judgment and unbearable weight pressing down upon her. At last, Eleanor Hargrove broke the silence, her voice calm yet authoritative. "Thank you for your apology, Miss Harlan, but I want you to understand something clearly." Bridget reluctantly turned back toward Eleanor, dread filling her gaze, anticipating the inevitable question that would deepen her shame. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and unwavering, directly locking onto Bridget's. "If I had been just another elderly passenger, if I had held no position or status, would you be standing here right now, apologizing in front of all these people?" The question struck Bridget like a physical blow, stealing her breath and leaving her visibly shaken. They all knew the answer. Had Eleanor Hargrove not been the airline's founder and chairwoman, Bridget would never have faced consequences or even second thoughts. She would have continued her day secure in her arrogance, untouched and unapologetic. Passengers shifted uneasily, some averting their eyes, others waiting tensely to see if Bridget would dare deny the bitter truth. Bridget finally spoke, her voice barely audible, filled with painful honesty. "No, I wouldn't." Eleanor studied Bridget silently, searching for sincerity or perhaps remorse. After a long, deliberate pause, she gave a slight, knowing nod and leaned back comfortably into her seat. Bridget's stomach twisted sharply as she turned, desperate to escape the scrutiny, when Victor Langston's commanding voice abruptly halted her retreat. "Miss Harlan," he said sternly, his voice neutral, yet carrying unmistakable weight. "You will personally attend to Mrs. Hargrove's needs for the remainder of this flight." Bridget froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. This wasn't simply a punishment, it was a clear public assertion of Eleanor Hargrove's rightful authority. For the remainder of this flight, Bridget would serve as a visible example of her own severe misjudgment, a constant reminder of her humiliation and the consequences of her arrogance. Eleanor simply picked up her glass of water, leaning back quietly with calm authority. Her presence alone, elegant and composed, would serve as a powerful reminder to everyone aboard, particularly Bridget Harlan, that dignity, respect, and humanity should never be judged by appearance alone. Now, instead of retreating to the galley to hide from the passengers' judgmental eyes, Bridget Harlan would be forced to personally attend to Eleanor Hargrove, the very woman she had publicly shamed. Eleanor, unbothered and serene, simply picked up a novel and slowly turned the page, silently reinforcing a clear message. This wasn't over yet. Bridget felt her entire body tense at Victor Langston's stern instruction. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a direct command and one she couldn't afford to ignore. A part of her wanted desperately to protest, to claim that any other attendant could manage the task, but Bridget knew she had pushed her luck too far already. The humiliation of publicly apologizing had shattered her pride, yet this punishment felt even more excruciating. The murmurs throughout the cabin had subsided, but the silence remained oppressive, thick with unresolved tension. The passengers were no longer just spectators. They now watched attentively, waiting to see how Bridget would navigate her harsh new reality. Beside her, Sophia Langford hesitated visibly, uncertain whether she should offer assistance. But Victor Langston's unyielding stare made it clear there would be no negotiations. Bridget took a sharp breath, forcing herself to turn stiffly toward Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "If there's anything you require during the flight, Mrs. Hargrove," she managed to say through clenched teeth, her voice strained and almost inaudible, "please do not hesitate to ask." Eleanor didn't immediately look up from her book. Instead, she deliberately finished the sentence she was reading, letting the moment stretch uncomfortably before finally raising her eyes to meet Bridget's gaze. Eleanor's expression held neither smugness nor visible satisfaction, only the same serene, dignified authority she'd carried from the start. "I'll keep that in mind," Eleanor said simply, her voice calm yet final, before calmly returning her attention to the pages of her novel. The dismissal was absolute, carrying the weight of Eleanor's quiet dignity. Bridget felt her cheeks flush painfully as she turned to the front of the cabin, forced now to remain in full view of every passenger. No escape, no chance to hide her disgrace. Victor Langston, clearly satisfied that justice had been firmly asserted, gave Bridget one final, decisive glance before striding purposefully toward the cockpit. Sophia lingered briefly, casting Bridget a cautious glance filled with something, perhaps pity, perhaps uncertainty. "I can help you if you need anything," Sophia whispered gently. Bridget tightened her jaw, pride wounded yet refusing Sophia's sympathy. "I can handle it," she muttered stiffly. Sophia nodded reluctantly, clearly unconvinced, and with one final sympathetic glance toward Eleanor, she stepped away, leaving Bridget isolated and exposed. Standing awkwardly alone, Bridget felt every gaze piercing into her back. Passengers suddenly stole glances, feigning interest in magazines or in-flight entertainment, but undeniably fixated on her humiliation. Callum Everett, the young businessman who had witnessed it all, no longer hid his observation. He openly studied her, fingers rhythmically tapping against his armrest, his expression neither mocking nor fully compassionate, merely observant, as if witnessing a lesson he doubted Bridget had fully grasped yet. Bridget forced herself to stand tall, though internally she felt twisted and diminished. She had never felt smaller. The weight of her disgrace was overwhelming, pressing relentlessly upon her. As the flight continued, Bridget tried desperately to maintain a facade of professionalism, to perform her duties mechanically as though nothing had happened. Yet she couldn't ignore Eleanor's presence. Each time she passed the elderly woman's seat, the quiet authority emanating from Eleanor's calm demeanor intensified Bridget's discomfort. Not because Eleanor did anything, but precisely because she did nothing. She merely existed, reading quietly, occasionally sipping her water or glancing thoughtfully out the window. Yet now and again, Eleanor's calm eyes flickered toward Bridget, lingering for just a moment, not in anger or contempt, but in quiet, powerful observation. And somehow, this silent scrutiny was infinitely worse. At one point, Bridget carried a fresh tray of refreshments through the first-class cabin. As she approached Eleanor's seat, her steps faltered slightly. She hesitated, debating internally whether she should speak or silently place the glass in retreat. But Eleanor noticed her uncertainty and raised her gaze calmly, her expression unreadable. I brought you some fresh water," Bridget said quietly, her voice noticeably weaker than usual. Eleanor offered a subtle nod, placing her book gently onto her lap. "Thank you," she replied softly, her eyes never wavering. Bridget's hand trembled slightly as she placed the glass on Eleanor's tray table. The water wobbled, spilling slightly, before landing with a quiet clink. Bridget immediately withdrew her hands, humiliation burning fiercely at her rare moment of clumsiness. She never faltered, never fumbled, yet here she stood, vulnerable and visibly shaken in front of Eleanor's piercing gaze. As Bridget straightened and prepared to escape, Eleanor's gentle voice halted her once again. "You've been employed by this airline for a long time, haven't you, Miss Harlan?" Bridget stiffened, instantly wary. "Yes," she responded cautiously, uncertainty evident in her voice. Eleanor studied her quietly, thoughtfully, then nodded once in acknowledgement, her calm authority unshaken. "Then you, of all people, should understand the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect." Bridget felt her chest tighten painfully. Eleanor's softly spoken words struck deeper than any harsh reprimand. Her subtle yet profound rebuke hung heavily in the silence between them, a gentle but devastating indictment of Bridget's earlier actions. Bridget's throat tightened. Her pride shattered anew under the weight of Eleanor's quiet, powerful truth. "And in all that time," Eleanor Hargrove continued calmly, her eyes gently probing Bridget Harlan, "has anyone ever questioned whether you truly belonged here?" Bridget's stomach twisted painfully at the piercing question. She knew exactly what Eleanor was asking. Had anyone ever doubted her competency? Had anyone dismissed her before she had a chance to prove herself worthy? The answer was obvious. Of course not. Bridget had always walked confidently through the cabin, never experiencing scrutiny or condescension. Never once had she been made to feel she didn't belong. Yet that was exactly how she had treated Eleanor. Bridget's mouth went dry. Her first instinct was to defend herself, to claim it wasn't about Eleanor personally, that she had merely been enforcing rules. But deep down, she knew it would be a lie. For the first time in her long career, Bridget Harlan had nothing to say. Eleanor didn't press further. Instead, she calmly lifted her water glass, took a slow sip, and returned to her book. The moment left hanging in the air with devastating clarity. Bridget turned away, but the weight of Eleanor's question followed her like a haunting shadow. For the first time, it wasn't just humiliation she felt. It was something deeper, sharper, more difficult to shake off. Shame. She moved through the first-class cabin like a ghost, each step heavier than the last. Every glance from passengers reminded her vividly of the moment she'd lost control. She had spent her career commanding respect, enforcing order, ensuring flights ran flawlessly. But now she was the one being taught a painful lesson. Bridget tried desperately to distract herself, pouring drinks, straightening trays, offering strained mechanical smiles. Yet her mind kept circling back to Eleanor's piercing words. "Has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here?" Bridget already knew the answer, and it sickened her. At the front of the plane, Victor Langston stood silently near the galley, arms folded across his chest, observing Bridget's stiff movements through narrowed eyes. She could feel his scrutiny, tracking each hesitation, each falter. "You're struggling," he finally remarked quietly when she approached. Bridget bristled defensively. "I'm fine," she muttered, reaching hastily for a tray of refreshments. Victor sighed softly, shaking his head. "No, you're not." Bridget clenched her jaw, refusing to respond. Victor leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice so only she could hear, each word heavy with meaning. "You've been doing this job for a long time, Harlan. Long enough to know better than to behave as you did today." Bridget stiffened sharply, but Victor pressed on relentlessly, voice calm yet firm. "You made an assumption about Mrs. Hargrove. It wasn't about tickets or protocol. It was about what you personally believed a first-class passenger should look like." Bridget's fingers dug painfully into the edge of the galley counter. "I didn't mean—" Victor's voice cut sharply through her feeble excuse. "It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did." Bridget flinched slightly but held her composure, straightening her shoulders, voice clipped and strained. "I already apologized." Victor studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze probing deeply. Finally, he nodded slowly, his voice soft yet cutting. "Yes, you did. But do you truly understand what you're apologizing for?" Bridget's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to snap back indignantly, claiming she understood perfectly that she'd simply misjudged a passenger. But deep inside, she recognized what Victor was truly asking. Not whether she understood her mistake, but whether she understood the bias that had fueled it. Unable to confront that reality, Bridget turned sharply away, fidgeting nervously with napkins that didn't need adjusting. "I need to get back to work," she murmured stiffly. Victor didn't push further. He stepped back, allowing her space, his final words lingering meaningfully. "Then get back to work." As Bridget moved through the cabin, Victor's words echoed relentlessly. Passengers quietly settled, meals were served, drinks carefully placed. Yet the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Bridget was no longer the respected, confident attendant. She was now an object lesson in humility, watched closely by every passenger who had witnessed her downfall. Callum Everett, the businessman who had seen everything unfold, caught Bridget's eye as she passed his seat. "Quite the day, isn't it?" he remarked casually, swirling his glass with deliberate ease. Bridget forced a brittle smile. "Just another flight," she responded lightly, feigning composure. Callum smiled slightly, clearly unconvinced. He glanced deliberately toward Eleanor Hargrove, serene in her seat, calmly flipping a page, then turning back to Bridget, his voice lowered with pointed observation. "I fly first class regularly. I've seen flight attendants like you, strict, efficient, no tolerance for nonsense. Usually I respect that." Bridget's eyebrow twitched, anticipating the sting. "Usually," Callum repeated thoughtfully, taking a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving her. "But today I saw someone who decided she had the right to judge who belonged and who didn't." He paused, allowing his words to sink in deeply. "That's not respect. That's bias." Bridget felt his words strike like a physical blow. She wanted desperately to turn away, to dismiss him just as she'd dismissed Eleanor. But she couldn't, because deep down she knew he was right. Callum didn't press further. He simply returned calmly to his drink, conversation finished. Bridget turned stiffly away, the heaviness in her chest growing unbearable. For years, she'd prided herself on following strict guidelines, believing herself professional, fair, and competent. But today, she'd come face to face with a harsh truth. She had twisted those standards to justify her own prejudices. Bridget moved numbly through the cabin, haunted by thoughts she'd tried to suppress. Each glance, each whispered word from the passengers felt like an accusation, underscoring her failure. The hum of the aircraft became background noise as Victor's, Callum's, and Eleanor's voices repeated relentlessly in her mind, confronting her with uncomfortable truths she couldn't ignore. She had judged Eleanor before the older woman ever spoke a word, instantly assuming she didn't belong in first class. Had Victor not intervened, had Eleanor Hargrove not been Eleanor Hargrove, Bridget's bias would have gone unnoticed, unquestioned, uncorrected. The realization felt like a gut punch, leaving Bridget hollow and painfully exposed. A sudden crackle of the intercom jolted her back to reality. The captain's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Bridget straightened instinctively, smoothing her uniform in an attempt to shake off the overwhelming shame. She moved on autopilot, checking seatbelts, securing trays, going through familiar motions she'd performed countless times before. Yet her mind lingered back at the gate, back to the exact moment she'd made a disastrous judgment, a decision she'd never once second-guessed until now. She reached Eleanor Hargrove's seat last. The elderly woman sat poised, her seatbelt already securely fastened, quietly watching the city emerge through the window below. For a moment, Bridget simply stood there, unsure what, if anything, she should say. Before she could decide, Eleanor spoke softly without turning. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Bridget tensed slightly. "Thinking about what?" Eleanor finally turned to face her, eyes unreadable yet compelling. "About why you did it." Bridget opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. Eleanor was right. She had been questioning herself since the moment she left the cockpit, since publicly owning up to her failure. Standing before Eleanor, all excuses evaporated. For the first time, she confronted herself honestly. The plane jolted gently as the landing gear extended. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt strangely still, heavy with unspoken truths. Bridget finally exhaled shakily. I don't know why I did it," she admitted quietly. And for the first time, it wasn't an evasion. It was honest, raw truth. Eleanor studied her thoughtfully, nodding slowly. "Then perhaps it's time you find out." Bridget swallowed painfully, recognizing she needed to face her biases directly. She wasn't certain she could repair this damage or even deserve to, but one thing was clear. This moment, this mistake, would follow her far beyond the end of the flight. The wheels touched down with a firm yet smooth landing. A gentle murmur stirred among passengers. Seatbelts clicked open instinctively as a calm voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated, with your seatbelts fastened until the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of our entire crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us today. The familiar announcement washed through the cabin, accompanied by the rustling of bags, quiet conversations resuming, and the impatient shifting of passengers preparing to disembark. Yet Bridget Harlan felt none of her usual relief or satisfaction upon landing. Instead, an unfamiliar dread settled deep in her chest, a gnawing apprehension that made her stomach twist painfully. She stared anxiously toward the jet bridge, already sensing that whatever awaited her beyond the aircraft doors would not be good. At the front of the first-class cabin, Victor Langston was speaking quietly but urgently into the in-flight phone, his posture rigid, clearly coordinating with ground operations. Bridget noticed the subtle tension in his movements. This was more than just a standard landing procedure. Meanwhile, Eleanor Hargrove remained poised, entirely unruffled, as she slowly gathered her belongings. Her movements were elegant and unhurried, betraying no sense of urgency. As Eleanor reached gently for her handbag and cane, her eyes briefly flickered toward Bridget. The look was subtle, yet unmistakably weighted with meaning. Bridget forced herself to maintain her composure, standing straight despite her internal turmoil. She had apologized. She had served Eleanor dutifully through the flight, but somehow it still felt painfully unfinished. The seatbelt sign finally switched off with a gentle ding, prompting the passengers to rise, calmly reaching for their belongings. First-class passengers moved at their customary, unhurried pace, adjusting jackets and carefully retrieving designer bags. Callum Everett smoothly stood up, adjusting his suit jacket casually before turning to Bridget with a measured glance. "Well," he remarked softly, his tone smooth yet pointed, "this was certainly memorable." Bridget said nothing, her expression rigid. Callum paused, studying her thoughtfully before nodding slowly. "You'll remember today for a long time, I imagine." Bridget felt something tighten sharply within her chest, unwilling to admit how deeply correct he was. Without awaiting her response, Callum turned, stepping confidently from the plane into the jet bridge, leaving Bridget to gather her nerve for what lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, Bridget steadied herself, trying desperately to regain composure despite her trembling hands and leaden feet. She turned back toward Eleanor Hargrove, who was calmly adjusting the strap of her elegant handbag, gripping her polished ivory cane lightly, radiating the same steady authority she had demonstrated from the start. Eleanor showed no eagerness to exit the aircraft. Instead, her movements were measured, calm, and deliberate. At last, Eleanor's eyes found Bridget's once again, studying her closely as if examining an unsolved puzzle. Bridget felt exposed, acutely aware of Eleanor's quiet yet profound scrutiny. Then Eleanor spoke quietly, her voice carrying undeniable authority. "Walk with me." Bridget blinked in surprise, momentarily unsure if she had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" Eleanor nodded subtly toward the open jet bridge, her expression gentle yet unyielding. "Walk with me," she repeated clearly, indicating this was not a request, it was an expectation. Every muscle in Bridget's body tightened in resistance, desperate to remain behind, to escape what awaited her. But Victor Langston's commanding voice swiftly sliced through her hesitation. "Go," Victor instructed, his tone firm and uncompromising, making it unmistakably clear that Bridget had no choice in the matter. Bridget clenched her jaw, exhaling sharply through her nose, and nodded stiffly in acknowledgement. As Eleanor Hargrove rose gracefully from her seat, Bridget reluctantly fell into step just behind her, following her into the jet bridge, feeling as if she were walking toward her own judgment. The short walk through the jet bridge seemed to stretch endlessly, every step magnified by Bridget's anxiety. As soon as they stepped into the bustling airport terminal, she felt an immediate shift in the air, a sense of expectation, of something awaiting her. Eleanor moved slowly but confidently, her cane gently tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. Bridget followed closely, forcing herself to maintain a professional posture even as panic surged inside her. Passengers instinctively parted for Eleanor, not merely due to her age or appearance, but because she carried an aura of undeniable presence, of quiet yet commanding authority. Bridget had spent years orchestrating flights, projecting strength and control. But now, walking beside Eleanor, she felt utterly powerless. As the terminal opened before them, crowded with travelers and filled with the usual airport chaos, Bridget's heart jolted sharply. Ahead stood a group of airline executives gathered near a restricted access point. At their center was Derek Langley, the airline's top executive, his presence formidable and coldly authoritative. And beside him stood airport security officials. Bridget's breath caught painfully in her chest, her steps faltering slightly before she quickly forced herself forward. Eleanor never broke stride, approaching the assembled group without hesitation. Bridget could feel her future closing in rapidly, the consequences she had dreaded becoming terrifyingly real. Executives straightened immediately as Eleanor Hargrove approached, their expressions respectful, yet undeniably tense. Derek Langley stepped forward first, greeting Eleanor with utmost professionalism. "Mrs. Hargrove," Derek began smoothly, inclining his head respectfully. "I trust your flight was enlightening." Eleanor offered a small, knowing smile. "Oh, indeed it was." Derek's sharp gaze shifted pointedly to Bridget, his tone turning cold and unequivocal. "Miss Harlan, we need to speak with you." Bridget felt her fingers tremble slightly at her sides, dread tightening her throat. "Sir, I—" Derek raised a hand sharply, cutting off her attempted explanation. "Not here," he stated flatly. "Come with us." Bridget felt her stomach plummet. At that moment, Eleanor calmly stepped forward, her gentle yet firm voice resonating clearly through the tense silence. "Miss Harlan understands the gravity of her actions," Eleanor stated evenly, her gaze firm and clear. "I'm confident she is prepared to fully accept responsibility. Isn't that right, Miss Harlan?" Bridget's throat tightened painfully. Throughout the flight, she had tried convincing herself that her humiliation, her public apology, had already paid the price. But now, standing before the airline's senior executives with airport security looming behind them, she realized the true repercussions had only just begun. Her career, her reputation, her very future was about to be decided. And for the first time in her life, Bridget Harlan wasn't sure if there was any way left to salvage her career or her dignity. She stood frozen in place, her mind struggling to grasp the gravity of the scene unfolding around her. The sounds of the bustling airport terminal seemed muted, distant, beneath the crushing weight of reality pressing upon her chest. This wasn't merely a reprimand, it was a reckoning. Derek Langley stood unwavering, his expression unreadable yet carrying absolute authority. The security officers standing close by conveyed everything Bridget needed to know. This conversation would not be quiet or discreet. Beside her, Eleanor Hargrove waited patiently, her expression composed, offering neither anger nor vindication, only a calm, resolute expectation. Bridget understood that Eleanor intended her to face the full consequences of her actions, and now there was nowhere left to hide. "Miss Harlan," Derek repeated firmly, his voice cutting clearly through her tangled thoughts. "Please come with us." For the first time in her distinguished career, Bridget hesitated. She had always been in control, always the one leading and directing others. Now, standing on the receiving end of scrutiny, being instructed to follow, to explain herself. She felt reduced, exposed, and painfully vulnerable. Bridget forced her legs to move, each step heavy and reluctant, as she followed Derek and the security officers toward the airline's executive offices. It felt disturbingly close to an arrest, though she knew technically it wasn't. Passengers lingering in the terminal glanced toward her, some openly curious, others quickly turning their heads away, pretending indifference. Yet she felt their gazes, judgmental whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd just as they'd echoed throughout the cabin. They reached a set of pristine glass doors bearing the airline's prestigious emblem. Behind these doors lay Bridget's fate. Derek swiped his badge across a discreet panel, the doors unlocking with an audible click. He gestured for her to step inside. Bridget hesitated briefly, casting one final glance toward Eleanor, who had quietly seated herself in the lounge area outside, still calm, collected, yet watching her carefully. Eleanor's gaze conveyed something Bridget couldn't quite decipher, a silent message of expectation, perhaps empathy, or maybe a challenge to confront her mistakes honestly. Unable to interpret it fully, Bridget turned away, stepping through the doorway, her breath catching as the doors sealed shut behind her. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was chilling, not in temperature, but in intensity. The polished, immaculate surface of the long conference table gleamed under harsh, fluorescent lighting. At the table's head sat Preston Whitaker, Senior Operations Manager, his sharp eyes locking onto Bridget the instant she entered. Flanking him were two other senior executives, each with thick files placed ominously before them, undoubtedly documenting her actions. Bridget's stomach twisted sharply, knowing her professional life was now condensed within those folders. Sit, Preston instructed, indicating a chair at the opposite end of the expansive table. Bridget obeyed silently, lowering herself stiffly, her spine rigid with tension. The security personnel took positions near the door, unmoving sentinels guarding against escape or disruption. Preston leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "You know exactly why you're here," he stated quietly, each word deliberate. Bridget forced herself to nod, her throat dry. "Yes, sir." Preston studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Then please," he said evenly, "explain exactly what happened on this flight." Bridget's instincts screamed for her to defend herself, to insist she'd been doing her job, following protocol, maintaining order and efficiency. But deep down, she recognized the truth. Those were empty excuses, masks hiding her bias. Drawing a painful breath, Bridget chose honesty. "I made an unjust assumption about a passenger," she admitted slowly, her voice steady but filled with regret. "Because of that assumption, I treated her unfairly." Preston didn't move, didn't visibly react. He simply waited, eyes assessing her carefully. Bridget forced herself onward, each admission more difficult than the last. "I publicly humiliated her. When she resisted, I I put my hands on her." Preston finally leaned back slightly, his expression still unreadable. "Do you fully comprehend what you've just admitted to, Miss Harlan?" Bridget felt her fingers tighten reflexively against her lap, her voice strained yet resolute. "Yes, sir." The executives exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her frankness. Preston exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Miss Harlan, you've been with this airline how long?" 10 years, Bridget replied quietly. 10 years, Preston repeated deliberately, shaking his head slowly. "Then you understand perfectly well that your actions constitute grounds for immediate termination." Bridget felt her stomach clench painfully. She had anticipated those words, but hearing them aloud made it vividly real. Preston flipped open the thick folder in front of him, quickly scanning the contents. "We have detailed passenger statements, a formal report from Captain Hawthorne, and a complaint filed directly by Mrs. Hargrove herself." Bridget's breath caught sharply. She hadn't realized Eleanor had officially documented her complaint. The weight of this revelation pressed down painfully upon her. Preston closed the folder, resting his hands deliberately atop its cover. "The only reason you're seated here right now, rather than already escorted from this building, is because Mrs. Hargrove herself requested you be given the opportunity to speak before any final decision is reached." Bridget's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, she requested that?" Preston maintained his calm gaze unyielding. "Yes." Bridget struggled to process this revelation. After everything she'd done, after publicly humiliating Eleanor, why would the woman whose dignity she'd shattered offer her any chance at redemption? Bridget glanced toward the glass doors beyond which Eleanor sat patiently, composed and quietly observant. The sight of Eleanor's steady composure sparked something within Bridget. Not fear or humiliation, but a fragile, cautious hope for redemption. Turning back to face Preston Whitaker, Bridget exhaled slowly, deliberately. "I know I deserve termination," she admitted, her voice subdued yet clear. "But I don't want my final act at this airline to be defined solely by my mistake." She lifted her chin, forcing strength into her voice. "I want a chance to demonstrate that I can truly learn from this." Preston raised an eyebrow skeptically, assessing her carefully. "And exactly how do you propose to accomplish that, Miss Harlan?" Bridget hesitated briefly. She didn't know precisely how she'd manage it, but for the first time in years, she was determined to try. "I'm not entirely certain yet," she admitted honestly, "but I am ready to do whatever it takes." A heavy silence settled over the room as her words resonated deeply. Preston studied her closely, expression cold yet intrigued, while the other executives exchanged cautious glances. For the first time in a long while, Bridget felt the power of her own vulnerability, not as weakness, but as a potential path toward genuine growth. Even the security officer standing quietly by the door appeared to be waiting to see if Bridget Harlan truly understood the gravity of her actions. She swallowed, forcing down the lump forming painfully in her throat. Throughout the flight, Bridget had tried to convince herself she'd done enough, that apologizing and enduring humiliation had sufficiently made amends. But sitting here, beneath their penetrating stares, she now understood the bitter truth. Apologizing wasn't enough. Simply claiming she had learned a lesson meant nothing without proof. Preston Whitaker leaned forward slowly, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished surface of the conference table. His gaze was steady, authoritative. Miss Harlan, do you fully grasp why the situation is so severe? Bridget inhaled sharply. She had anticipated this question, mentally prepared for it, but now faced with the necessity of speaking the words aloud. Their weight felt crushing. She thought back vividly to the moment she had stopped Eleanor Hargrove at the boarding gate, the careless ease with which she had dismissed her, how she'd never even attempted to verify Eleanor's ticket properly, how she'd already decided in her mind that Eleanor simply did not belong in first class. That was the raw, painful truth, and it was unbearably ugly. Bridget forced herself upright, shoulders back, confronting the truth head-on. I told myself I was just following protocol, she admitted quietly, her voice clear but strained. But that was a lie. Preston raised an eyebrow slightly, his tone calm but sharp. Then what exactly were you doing? She exhaled slowly, confronting herself openly. I was making a decision based on my own assumptions. The silence that followed was deafening, but Bridget felt a shift in the room. She hesitated briefly, then pushed forward. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to expose her real motivations. I looked at Mrs. Hargrove and I immediately assumed she didn't belong in first class, she confessed openly. I didn't verify her ticket properly, and when she resisted, I let my frustration take over. I placed my hands on her. Bridget's stomach twisted sharply with shame, yet Preston's gaze remained unwavering. You're acknowledging that your actions weren't merely a mistake, but driven by bias. The word bias stung deeply, tightening in her chest, yet Bridget could no longer deny its reality. She nodded slowly, painfully honest now. Yes. Admitting it felt like removing a blade embedded deep within her chest, excruciating, yet strangely liberating. For the first time, she wasn't saying it merely to save her career, nor to appease those around her. She was acknowledging it because at last she genuinely understood it. Preston leaned back slowly, folding his arms thoughtfully across his chest. The executives exchanged unreadable glances, visibly surprised at her frank admission. Bridget realized they had anticipated excuses, deflections, anything but the stark truth she had just laid bare. Preston exhaled slowly, meeting her eyes directly. And now, he asked firmly, what do you plan to do next? Bridget blinked, uncertain. Sir? Preston pressed, his voice steady, assessing her carefully. You claim you want to demonstrate growth, but words alone won't undo what's been done. What action are you prepared to take? Bridget hesitated momentarily, feeling the overwhelming weight of the damage she'd caused. Passengers had witnessed her humiliation of Eleanor firsthand. The airline's reputation was tarnished. Trust had been shattered. Yet despite everything, Bridget desperately wanted this moment to mark a turning point rather than a bitter ending. She inhaled deeply, gathering her resolve. I don't expect to leave here with my job, she admitted, voice firm but tinged with regret. Nor do I expect immediate forgiveness, but if given the opportunity, I want to help fix the very culture that allowed me to feel justified in my actions. Preston maintained his neutral expression, silently prompting her to continue. Bridget swallowed again, forcing out the truth she'd come to accept. This airline teaches us policies, safety procedures, customer service, but I don't think I ever genuinely understood what it meant to serve every passenger equally. I believed I did, but I didn't. Not truly. She met Preston's eyes resolutely. If I'm allowed to stay, I want to actively help change that. The room fell silent once more. Bridget wasn't certain she had said the right thing, only that for the first time her words felt genuine and sincere. Preston considered her closely, his eyes unreadable. Finally, he nodded curtly. Wait outside, he instructed. Bridget rose stiffly, nodding respectfully, her heart thudding unevenly. This time the security officers made no move to escort her, a minor relief amid overwhelming uncertainty. As she stepped out into the waiting area, her breath trembled slightly in her chest. Then her gaze settled on Eleanor Hargrove, calmly seated nearby, poised and patient. Eleanor slowly turned her head, meeting Bridget's eyes directly. For the first time since this ordeal began, Bridget didn't try to avoid Eleanor's gaze. She didn't look away, didn't pretend she wasn't standing precariously on the edge of losing everything. Instead, she stood quietly, openly acknowledging Eleanor's calm appraisal. "They're discussing your future in there," Eleanor said quietly, nodding gently toward the glass conference room doors, her tone steady and composed as though this were merely a casual conversation. But they weren't strangers anymore. Not after today. Bridget swallowed tightly. "I understand." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her gaze penetrating yet gentle, filled with a wisdom Bridget couldn't yet grasp fully. "Do you?" Bridget drew a shaky breath. For the first time, she truly faced what Eleanor was silently asking. Did she grasp the severity, the deeper meaning behind her actions? She had stood at the precipice of losing it all, convinced she'd done enough to atone. But now, seeing the composed woman before her, Bridget recognized that genuine accountability went beyond apology. It required true understanding, humility, and a commitment to meaningful change. For the first time in her life, Bridget Harlan realized she was finally ready to embrace all three. "And what do you think they'll decide?" Eleanor Hargrove asked gently, her eyes steady and patient. Bridget hesitated. If Eleanor had posed that question just an hour earlier, Bridget would have still been scrambling, grasping desperately for excuses, believing she could somehow argue her way out of accountability. But now, standing here exposed and vulnerable, Bridget wasn't sure she deserved to keep her job. She exhaled slowly, her throat tight. "I honestly don't know," she admitted softly. "I suppose it depends on whether they believe I can change." Eleanor studied her quietly, fingertips lightly tapping against the smooth ivory handle of her cane. "And can you?" Bridget's fingers twitched nervously at her sides, the question echoing deeply within her. "I'd like to try," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm with resolve. Eleanor gave a soft hum of acknowledgement, not approval, not dismissal, simply acknowledging the sincerity of Bridget's words. Somehow that understated sound carried more weight than anything else could have. Taking a slow, hesitant breath, Bridget finally asked the question she'd feared most. "Why did you ask them to give me a chance to explain myself?" Eleanor's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, yet something deeply thoughtful. "Because I wanted to see if you'd use that opportunity to defend yourself or if you'd face the truth." Bridget felt a profound realization settle heavily into her stomach. This was never about Eleanor wanting an apology or seeking justice from the airline. She had never needed either. Eleanor had given Bridget space to reveal her true self, to confront the ugly bias she had kept hidden even from herself. Eleanor hadn't been powerless at that gate, far from it. She had allowed Bridget to expose her flaws openly, guiding her quietly but deliberately toward true self-awareness. Bridget swallowed slowly. "You could have demanded I be fired immediately," she murmured, confronting the truth head-on. Eleanor's calm gaze never wavered. "Yes, I could have." Bridget hesitated before asking the deeper question gnawing at the edges of her mind. "Then why didn't you?" Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful and composed. Finally, she answered softly, yet powerfully. "Because I don't believe in allowing people to walk away from their mistakes without learning from them." The words resonated deeply within Bridget, stirring an unfamiliar sensation in her chest. Eleanor's actions hadn't been kindness or leniency, they had been purposeful. Eleanor Hargrove hadn't needed Bridget's apology or punishment. What she had truly wanted was for Bridget to genuinely see herself. And that was precisely what had happened. At that moment, the conference room doors opened abruptly. Bridget turned sharply, her breath catching as Preston Whitaker stepped out, his expression still unreadable. The other executives filed out behind him, their postures rigid, eyes briefly flickering toward Eleanor before settling firmly upon Bridget. Derek Langley remained near the doorway, assessing Bridget intently before finally speaking. "We've reached a decision." Bridget braced herself, fists tightening at her sides. Preston spoke carefully, clearly. "Effective immediately, you are placed on probation." Bridget's breath hitched, surprised. Probation. She had prepared herself for two distinct outcomes, either keeping her job entirely or immediate termination. But probation was different. It meant something far more complex. It meant she was being offered a chance. Preston continued, firm yet measured. You will undergo extensive additional training, including leadership development and comprehensive anti bias courses. Your performance and progress will be closely evaluated over the next 6 months. If at any point you fail to meet expectations, your employment will end immediately. Bridget felt stunned. She hadn't anticipated this, not an easy reprieve nor total loss. Instead, she was granted a genuine opportunity to demonstrate whether she could genuinely grow and change. The gravity of this decision settled heavily within her. Preston narrowed his gaze slightly. Do you fully understand? Bridget straightened, regaining her composure. Yes, sir. Preston nodded once, glancing briefly toward Eleanor. Mrs. Hargrove personally endorsed this outcome. Had she preferred termination, you wouldn't be standing here right now. Bridget slowly turned toward Eleanor. The older woman's gaze met hers directly, unflinching and calm. Eleanor hadn't fought to keep Bridget employed. She had advocated for her to earn the right to remain. Now, the responsibility rested entirely with Bridget. Bridget swallowed hard, sincerity evident in her soft words. Thank you. Eleanor nodded slowly, deliberately. Make it meaningful, she advised quietly. Then, with a gentle tap of her cane against the polished floor, Eleanor Hargrove turned and walked away, with the same dignified composure she had carried throughout the entire ordeal. The rhythmic tapping of her cane gradually faded until she disappeared into the bustling terminal crowd. Standing there, Bridget felt neither resentment nor relief. Instead, she felt small. Not the humiliation she'd felt earlier when confronted by the passengers, nor the embarrassment when reprimanded by Victor, but the humbling recognition of how much she still had left to learn. She had spent years believing she knew everything about her role, convinced she could judge passengers at a glance, believing she possessed the authority to determine who belonged and who didn't. But she had been wrong, and Eleanor Hargrove had given her the chance to recognize it clearly. Preston Whitaker's voice cut gently through her reflection. Report to training headquarters first thing Monday morning. You'll receive further instructions then. Bridget nodded stiffly, her voice steady but quiet. Yes, sir. Preston regarded her a final moment, exchanging silent glances with the other executives before they collectively departed, leaving Bridget alone. She exhaled deeply, releasing her clenched fists. She had been granted a second chance, but it wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an easy way out. It was a test, a challenge she was unsure she could pass. Around her, the airport buzzed with movement, passengers rushing, announcements echoing. But Bridget remained still, understanding profoundly for the first time that true redemption required genuine, sustained change. This moment and Eleanor Hargrove's quiet strength had given her clarity to move forward. She would have to first confront herself honestly, and that, she realized, would be the hardest journey she had ever taken. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.